When people hear the word megathrust, it might not sound like much, but in the world of natural disasters, it's one of the most dangerous things that can happen. A megathrust earthquake is not your typical ground-shaking event. These are the massive quakes that happen where two tectonic plates collide, with one being pushed under the other. These collisions happen in subduction zones, and when they release all that built-up pressure, the result can be truly devastating. To get an idea of what this could look like, we only need to go back to the year 2011, when Japan experienced one of the most powerful megathrust earthquakes ever recorded. That quake struck off the coast of Tohoku and caused not just intense ground shaking, but also a giant tsunami that swept inland, destroying entire towns and causing over $360 billion in damages. That single event remains one of the costliest natural disasters in history, and it shows just how dangerous these types of earthquakes really are. Now imagine if something like that were to happen again, but this time in a different part of the world that isn't as well prepared. Scientists have been warning about the Cascadia subduction zone along the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States. This fault runs from Northern California all the way up to British Columbia, and it has been quiet for a long time, maybe too long. Experts believe that if the Cascadia fault were to rupture in a full megathrust event, it could result in a quake larger than magnitude 9. That's strong enough to shake the ground for minutes, not just seconds, which is more than enough time to cause serious destruction. The first wave of damage would come from the shaking itself. Buildings not designed to handle that kind of movement would crumble. Bridges could collapse. Roads would crack wide open, and power lines would snap. People in cities like Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver could be hit hard, and even areas far inland would feel the effects. Hospitals and emergency services would likely be overwhelmed right away, especially if communication systems go down too. But the shaking is just the beginning. One of the most dangerous parts of a megathrust earthquake is the tsunami that usually follows. Because the ocean floor gets violently shoved upward during the quake, it sends a massive surge of water racing across the sea. In some places, there would only be a few minutes of warning. Entire coastal communities could be swallowed by waves taller than houses. In low-lying towns near the coast, there would be little time to get to higher ground. What makes megathrust earthquakes so scary is that they don't just affect one city or one area. They can impact whole regions at once. Ports, airports, highways, and train systems could all be knocked out in a matter of minutes, and once that happens, getting supplies, rescue crews, or even basic help into the disaster zone becomes incredibly difficult. Even the ground itself could change forever. These earthquakes can cause the land to drop several feet, which means that some places that used to be above sea level could suddenly find themselves permanently underwater. That's not just a short-term problem, that's long-term flooding that could wipe towns right off the map. This is why scientists are so focused on megathrust earthquakes. They don't happen often, but when they do, the damage is off the charts. The next one could hit without warning, and if it does, the question is not just where or when, it's how bad will it be. One of the biggest challenges with megathrust earthquakes is how little warning people get before they strike. Unlike hurricanes or storms that can be tracked days in advance, these earthquakes happen deep beneath the surface, where pressure quietly builds over decades or even centuries. Then suddenly, everything gives way. That moment when all the energy is released at once is what makes these events so powerful and dangerous. Researchers are using tools like GPS satellites and deep sea sensors to try and understand where this stress is building and how close we might be to a major event. These tools can detect tiny movements in the Earth's crust, sometimes just a few millimeters a year, but over time those tiny shifts mean something big is coming. Some areas, like the Pacific Northwest, have been slowly moving for hundreds of years without a large quake to release that pressure, and when it finally does happen, it won't be a small release. It'll be the kind of sudden, violent shift that sends shock waves for hundreds of miles in every direction. The damage wouldn't just stop at buildings and roads. A megathrust earthquake would also severely impact basic infrastructure, especially utilities. Power grids would be knocked out, gas lines could rupture and catch fire, and water systems could break down entirely. That could leave millions of people without electricity, clean water, or heat. Especially if it happens during colder months. In coastal areas, seawalls and flood defenses might be destroyed by the tsunami, leaving communities vulnerable to more damage after the initial impact. And then there's the economic side. Ports that serve as hubs for imports and exports could be destroyed in minutes. In the United States alone, Ports like Seattle and Portland handle billions of dollars worth of goods each year. If those are shut down, supply chains would be disrupted, not just locally, but globally. Everything from food and fuel to electronics and medicine could suddenly become hard to get. Large businesses might have backup plans, but small businesses and everyday people would struggle to bounce back. Insurance claims would flood in, and rebuilding would take years. Even 10 years after the quake in Japan in the year 2011, some coastal towns were still struggling to recover. Now imagine that kind of damage happening in several countries at once. That's the scale we're talking about when it comes to a megathrust earthquake. One of the most serious problems would be housing. With thousands or even hundreds of thousands of buildings damaged or destroyed, many people would be forced to leave their homes. Emergency shelters would fill quickly, and some people might not be able to return home for months or even years. In areas hit hardest by tsunamis, entire neighborhoods might be gone altogether. That kind of displacement can have long-lasting effects on families, schools, and entire communities. What makes all of this even more difficult is that megathrust earthquakes often strike areas that are heavily populated and near the ocean. That means there's a higher risk for loss of life, damage to property, and disruption to everyday life. These aren't isolated mountain regions with few people. They're often major cities, ports, and transportation centers that millions of people rely on every single day. And while scientists are getting better at understanding where these events are most likely to happen, predicting exactly when they will hit is still impossible. That's why so many researchers are focused on preparation rather than prediction, because when the next one hits, and it will be too late to prepare. One of the most dangerous things about a megathrust earthquake is what follows it. Massive aftershocks that can last for weeks or even months. Aftershocks might not be as strong as the initial quake, but they still cause serious damage, especially to already weakened buildings and roads, hospitals, emergency shelters, and communication systems that barely held together after the first quake could collapse entirely during one of these follow-up quakes. In addition to the shaking, the ground itself can shift in ways that completely change the landscape. In past megathrust earthquakes, entire coastlines have moved. In the year 2011, parts of Japan's shoreline shifted by more than 8 feet. That kind of sudden land movement can change the course of rivers, damage pipelines, and even affect underground aquifers. Bridges, railways, and highways could be left twisted or broken, cutting off entire regions from help. One of the most overlooked threats that follows a megathrust earthquake is disease. When clean water is hard to come by, sanitation systems are broken, and thousands of people are packed into emergency shelters, it creates the perfect conditions for illness to spread. In the aftermath of past earthquakes, outbreaks of stomach viruses, respiratory infections, and skin diseases have been common. If it happens in colder climates, things like hypothermia and frostbite also become major concerns, especially if heating systems are down for long periods. Farming regions near subduction zones would also be hit hard. Farmland could be flooded by tsunamis, contaminated with salt water, or completely shifted by the force of the quake. Crops could be wiped out for the season, and irrigation systems might be destroyed. That means fewer food supplies, higher prices, and even shortages, especially if supply lines are already down due to damage at ports and roads. There's also the mental toll. Survivors of megathrust earthquakes often deal with trauma, stress, and anxiety for years afterward. The constant fear of aftershocks, the uncertainty about whether homes and schools will ever be rebuilt, and the loss of loved ones all take a toll on people's health and well-being. Children in particular are deeply affected by the sudden change in routine and the chaos around them. Another long-term concern is how such a disaster would affect global cooperation. If multiple countries are hit at once, or if one country is hit so hard that it needs outside help, there could be competition for resources. Things like rescue crews, medical supplies, construction materials, and even food aid might not be available in large enough quantities to help everyone right away. This can lead to tension, especially if the disaster disrupts diplomatic or trade relationships. Scientists have even warned that megathrust earthquakes could trigger additional earthquakes in nearby regions. When one fault shifts, it can sometimes cause pressure to build up in surrounding faults. That means a single massive earthquake could start a chain reaction of seismic activity in places that weren't even directly hit at first. That kind of domino effect could cause problems across entire continents. Finally, there's the environmental cost. Landslides caused by the earthquake could bury forests, rivers could become blocked or redirected, and chemical spills from damaged factories or power plants could leak into the soil and air. In areas where nuclear power plants sit near fault lines or coastlines, there's also the fear of radiation leaks. These environmental disasters can take decades to clean up and may leave some areas unsafe to live in for generations. When we think about the next megathrust earthquake, one of the most important things to talk about is how communities can prepare before it happens. In places near subduction zones like the Pacific Northwest, emergency planners are focusing more and more on building codes. Stronger rules mean new buildings must be designed to sway with the ground rather than crack and fall. These changes might seem small, but they can save thousands of lives when a major earthquake hits. One major concern for coastal towns is evacuation. Because megathrust earthquakes often cause tsunamis, people near the ocean only have a short window, sometimes just 10 to 15 minutes, to get to high ground. That's why communities in places like Oregon, Washington, and parts of British Columbia have started building vertical evacuation towers. These structures are specially designed to withstand the shaking and the waves, giving people a place to run if there's no time to drive inland. In many areas, especially along the Ring of Fire, scientists are pushing for better early warning systems. These systems can detect the first signs of a quake and send out alerts before the worst shaking starts. In Japan, for example, their system can give people up to a minute of warning. That may not sound like much, but it's enough time to stop trains, shut down gas lines, and tell people to get to safety. The hope is that more countries will invest in these systems before the next disaster strikes. Schools and hospitals are also being reevaluated. Many older buildings weren't built with megathrust quakes in mind. In places like Chile and Indonesia, major hospital upgrades have started so that emergency services don't collapse right when they're needed most. In the United States, California has already spent billions reinforcing hospitals to make sure they stay standing during a major quake. These upgrades are costly, but when disaster hits, they can be the difference between life and death for thousands. One challenge that's harder to fix is economic resilience. If a megathrust earthquake destroys a major port, it can stall the economy of an entire country. Take the Port of Los Angeles or the Port of Vancouver, both handle huge amounts of cargo. If they go offline, it doesn't just affect the West Coast, it can delay supplies across the country. This is why disaster planning now includes alternative routes and backup transportation hubs to keep goods moving even if major ports are damaged. Another area being explored is how nature can help us. In some countries, engineers are working with natural defenses like coastal forests and wetlands to reduce the impact of tsunamis. These natural barriers can slow waves down and help protect inland areas. While they can't stop the damage completely, they can reduce it enough to save lives and property. People are also being taught what to do when the ground starts shaking. Emergency drills are now part of school routines in many earthquake-prone areas. Families are encouraged to have go bags ready, filled with water, food, first aid supplies, and important documents. Cities are running simulations that test how well their response plans actually work. The idea is to make sure that when the time comes, everyone knows what to do without having to stop and think. One of the biggest lessons from past megathrust earthquakes is that rebuilding takes time, years or even decades. Some areas in Japan are still recovering from the quake and tsunami that hit in the year 2011. It takes a long time to bring back roads, homes, businesses, and a sense of normal life. That's why planning for recovery is just as important as planning for the earthquake itself. Who will pay for the rebuilding? How can communities make sure they rebuild smarter and safer than before? And in the end, the next megathrust earthquake will not just test buildings and roads, it will test how well people can work together. From local leaders to national governments, from neighbors helping neighbors to scientists and engineers building better systems, every piece matters. There's no way to stop the next megathrust earthquake, but by preparing now, we can make sure we're ready to survive it and to recover afterward stronger than before.